Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, exciting to talk about this topic with this individual in particular. He writes over at Arc Digital, which I wrote at a couple times way back in the way back. Alan Elrod, how are you, sir? Thank you for joining us on the program.
I'm doing great. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. He'll talk about the Pulaski Institute he's involved with in just a little bit. He teaches at ASUBB. That's after Cabot, but if you go to Searcy, you went too far for those of you in the Jacksonville area. Some of my old stomping grounds from where I got sent to Little Rock. But that's another story for another day. You're writing in Arc Digital. Look, this is a this is a very specific breaking news cycle instance on a very old topic that we have constantly been discussing since the beginning of America. And if you go in philosophy and history, humans have always been debating this. When you strip away all the names and you strip away the politician names and the pundit names and all the buzzwords and all the social media stuff and the political stuff, what we're really talking about in this piece in Arc Digital, and we're going to link to the whole thing, we're talking about freedom and we're talking about a pluralistic society. Now, that word gets thrown around a lot, but it really is something that America has a little bit of a unique claim on. We're a big pluralistic society, or at least we should be. Let's start with that term and that word, because if we don't have a good handle on that, the rest of this is going to get in the weeds real fast.
So, the idea of a pluralistic society is one where multiple groups of people, and that can be broken down into all kinds of categories, religions, ethnicities, cultures, are able to live and thrive and, most importantly, enjoy the expression of those identities in a way that's not, unduly restricted, right? And that's really what it comes down to, right? And that's in many ways, the story of American society has been the fight for that very thing, right? And so while we tend to look, I think, today on U.S. history and society as sort of a place where, okay, we've achieved that now, right? So we tell the story about how we got there. It's still really important to be vigilant to all the ways in which those principles can be undermined.
Yeah, and the way they get undermined and what you're getting to the thrust of here is the relationship between the government and freedom, whether that's freedom of speech, whether that's freedom of a business to do whatever a business is going to do. It gets complicated because government does have a regulatory function, but then we get politics involved and we get cultures involved. And then those two lines start crossing. You're using the example down in Florida, but when those lines all start crossing, that's when you get to the heart of not only pluralism, but also what freedom means, because there's a push-pull element to freedom that you're just never going to get out of that equation of more freedom here means a little less freedom over here. And that's the tug of war that we're always going to deal with here, right?
Yeah, I think with this kind of thing, there's always the tension of there's the legal question, right, of freedom, and whether or not speech is being legally restricted, whether or not expression is being legally restricted, whether or not government is regulating people's freedoms. And then there's another kind of question about the culture of free expression, right? Are we fostering a kind of culture that is open, that is willing to embrace difference? And the real test of that is always difference that we don't like, right? Because everyone thinks that the thing that they would like to censor, that they would like to see less of, falls into that special category of things that deserve, right, censorship or restraint or restriction in some way, right? Everyone thinks that their special thing, is the exception. And fighting against that impulse is a really, really hard thing.
Yeah, Alan Elrod joining us. This is where you get into, because lots of people want to do things like censorship, like cutting down somebody's right to speak or somebody's right to do whatever, but they'll slap that freedom word on the front end of it. So how do we start parsing that out when we get news like the debates in academia, the debates in education, the debates in free speech and media of media companies doing this, that, or the other? Where do we start discerning this out? Because lots of people can put freedom on the front end of that statement, not really meaning it. That's kind of where we get into the buzzword part of this, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, right. People love to call everything a free speech issue, and in the sort of literal legal constitutional sense, that's not the case, right? Obviously, the government restraining speech or putting punishments on speech as a consequence of speech actions, that's when it becomes a First Amendment issue, right? But that's why I think it's so important to keep that distinction. And I don't want to go too far in the weeds, like you said, but the reason why Karl Popper and his idea of the open society is so important to all this is Popper's fundamental argument is that not that truth is relative, but that, and I think this is something we can see when we look through history, the most virtuous way to run a society is something that's always in contention. And the best way to make sure that we're actually living in a society that is pursuing good ends, that is letting people try to live their best lives, is to have one where people really can, both kind of in their personal lives and the way they live it, and in the sense of public debate, assert different ideas about what it looks like to live a good life, to live a free life, and to shape society how it ought to be. And that actually is, I think, again, so important to say, because we do see this sometimes from the left as well. It's really hard to be committed to that. It is really, really hard to be committed to that idea of a genuinely open society where we accept that people are going to have different ideas about what's good, but that placing limits on how people live their lives or how people express themselves is really the worst possible way to actually mitigate the bad.
Yeah, Alan Elrod joining us. Anytime we reference somebody like a Popper, though, we need to understand what he was writing about, what he was talking about. You opened your piece in Arc Digital. Again, we're going to link to it. Read the whole thing. This is an extensive piece. There's a lot of links in this piece you need to click through as well. Make up your own mind about it. Popper's writing about, the quotes you're pulling from him are actually in the 70s, towards the end of his life. He's writing about the events of the 20th century, obviously, the Nazis in Europe, Soviet Union, these kind of oppressions, fascism all the way back in the 30s, he even touched on in some places. That's what he was framing his discussion about. Now, Twitter being Twitter and Facebook being Facebook, everybody we don't like is obviously a Nazi or a communist or whatever.
Right.
So the terminology gets carried over, but they're not the same things. However, what are the core principles that carry over, even though we use those as kind of the worst case scenarios? We're not in those worst case scenarios yet, God willing, but some of those principles should carry over. What are the principles under the buzzwords we need to glean from that?
I think the core difference really gets at the simpler terms that are underneath that idea of pluralism, and that's difference. And human beings struggle with difference, right? That's at the root of racial prejudice through history, but it's also at the root of things like the tribalism we experience today, right? We're really bad when we encounter difference at managing our response to it. And the core here is this idea that if the big thing that I know about the world that I'm convinced is true is really actually not is really true, but is really worthwhile, that there is actually a chance in an open society where we can debate and be contentious, but also do it in a way where we know that we're not going to throw anyone in jail, but also that we're not going to try to overly silence anyone else. That there is always that kind of sense that we can come to sometimes compromises, sometimes not, sometimes ideal conclusions, but also that the risk is worth it, right? Because democratic societies have been the kinds of places that have sometimes produced, right, fascism and authoritarianism, right? Weimar Germany was this, in many ways, very permissive place that was what preceded Nazi Germany. So I think that's also the scary part is we have to accept the risks of embracing difference, of embracing the idea that living together as people means a whole lot of different ideas about what the life of an individual or the life of a whole society should look like. And that's really hard to do.
Yeah, Alan Elrod joining us. Let's do some history real quick because I think it's a really important touchstone because it's something that gets brought up. You just
Mhm.
mentioned the Weimar Republic. Of course, that is pre-Nazi Germany, what was going on
Right.
between the First World War, Second World War. It was a disaster on an economic level, but that was also stuff that came out of World War One.
Mhm.
We have all these pundits, and you just mentioned it, and you talk about it in your piece. They point to the cultural part of the Weimar Republic. They talk about, a very open society, a very decadent society, a very
Mhm.
tolerant society. It was very well known for lasciviousness, for lack of a better term, without getting too far into it. That's a fair way to put it, right? There was a lot going on. However, what happens is the people that want to discuss the things going on now say, oh, well, that society was so tolerant that gave way to Nazi Germany. That's not a straight line. Those two things are not exactly the same thing. But when we're going to talk about pluralism and freedom, the people that want to use the term freedom as a battering ram against things they don't like, they simplify something like that and then try to use it as an example going forward. That's not really the case, though, is it?
No, absolutely not. And I think this is where we can kind of tether a few ideas. We can tether the sort of debate around the sexual permissiveness of Weimar and the conversations about today with drag shows and things to actually the more academic curriculum conversations around CRT. And we can link them really in this way. Because these things are messy and contentious and hard, and because there are always going to be groups that react negatively, right, to this kind of people living their lives in these very freely expressed ways. There is an appeal to groups that come along and assert a particular truth, a rigid truth, right? And the Nazis did that, right? That's what they did. They said, these are the mores. Obviously, there was the racial politics, but they had also, very kind of anti-gay, anti sort of prurient politics. And today, I find it really chilling for anyone to compare, drag shows today to Weimar Germany, because to me it says something kind of dark about the impulses that person may have towards the LGBT community today. But when we flip that over to conversations even about, CRT and history and curriculum, talking about history and race and power is supposed to be, I think, an explorative, interpretive process. I was an undergrad. I was trained as a historian, and history is difficult, right? And I think what you see at the core of a lot of these sort of curriculum changes that say that they're liberating students from these sort of what they think is overly racialized ideas about American history or about race and power dynamics. What they're really doing is saying, we really want to tidy up history and make it this sort of clean, more linear, positive thing. And it just isn't. And that, again, is not an assertion of relativism. It's an assertion that dynamism and messiness and difference are at the core of pretty much any human thing, history, culture, politics. But that the instinct to cover those things up, to conform them to more sort of rigid structures and ideas, is a persistent one over time. But it's one that we have to be really, really careful about resisting.
Yeah, Alan Elrod joining us. This is one of those things where, look, it's like you're on the interstate. You're trying not to ram the guy in front of you, and you don't want the person behind you to ram into the back end of you when you try to slow down, right? There's a balance here. Proper context on these things to me is I always try to lean as much as I can towards freedom and pluralism. And the reason why is because the path against those things always winds up in the same place. We know this through human nature that you just spoke of. We know this historically throughout history. There's so many examples of this. Yes, there is such a thing as, we got to have some rules and we got to have some law and order. But the people who want to crack down on very specific things and usually over cultural things, that's always a red flag to me. And it doesn't mean they're always wrong. It's just one of those things you got to discern. But when I look at it historically, and if I step back from the culture stuff and the buzzword stuff, if you're purposely going after specific things over and over and again, that's always a red flag to me, because pluralism is one of those all of the above as much as we can possibly do kind of things.
Absolutely. And I think this is where, even it's not just people right on the right. Like when you see sort of Twitter blow-ups about someone, whether it's a stray joke they made on the internet or some viral video or some report of something that was said or done. I think we always, always, always have to meet anytime there's like a call to discipline a person, to fire them or to have them, investigated. I think we have to start with a position of skepticism about those things. Now, it may very well be that actions need to be taken sometimes, but in general, I think it's really hard to resist that, right? Because as soon as whatever it is that's happened plays into our concerns, plays into our sort of preferred sort of issues or hobby horses, right? That rage boils up, that anger boils up. We feel very self-righteous, and suddenly a situation that might be very similar but involves slightly different players or issues where we would say, you can't discipline this person for what they've said. We're saying, well, but this is the special situation where you should be able to.
Alan Elrod joining us. How often does the special situation burn us? Let's take an example that you used in your piece. It's been in the headlines. We've been covering on the show before, the Disney situation in Florida. Mm-hmm. Look, Disney's one of those things. It's like Walmart back a decade or two ago. It's like Amazon now. They're the biggest thing on the block, so they get to be the easy target, right? And everybody knows what it is, so it's a universal messaging thing. Is if you're fighting with Disney, everybody knows what Disney is. You don't have to explain it, right? Disney and Florida have a long, complicated history. Ron DeSantis, the governor, has been making hay, picking fights with Disney on regulatory issues, on cultural issues, on a couple other things. How do we parse this out beyond the politics of it? Because obviously it works for him. Like, it hits the right nerves for his base and the audience he's aiming at. There's also a little bit of hypocrisy here because, no, they're not going to get rid of they are not going to take over Disney for the state. It would bankrupt the state if they did that. That's not going to happen either. Right. So there's some performative to this. But again, once we strip it all down, we're right back to the old adage. How much should government influence a major company that they're already in bed with? Let's just call it what it is, and try to affect what their product is and how the government interacts with them. This is a very, very old, you could go back as far as you want in human history and you have a government entity and a big business. This is an old story. This is just the new run on it, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's always a question of obviously government has a role in regulating. And if some governor of Florida had just come along and said, I think we need to reevaluate, the Reedy Creek Special Improvement District, that by itself is not alarming. What's alarming is the clear sense that this is about punishing Disney for speaking out against, right at the time, right, the so-called Don't Say Gay bill, which Disney did largely because its own LGBTQ employees were upset. And then also you have like all this other stuff of sort of conservative activists being angry about, right, the depiction of same-sex couples in Lightyear, right? Like, never mind the fact that, 70 plus years of Disney content has presented other very much more sort of, rigid ideas about relationships. So, it always comes down to sort of, in this kind of situation, the motivations, right, and the context, right? Regulating this business is not by itself nefarious. The idea that the state of Florida or that Ron DeSantis would try to wage this both regulatory and kind of PR battle against Disney as punishment, right, for speaking out against a bill, that is obviously not the kind of conduct. If that were being done, right, in a system, just in another country, we would say, well, that's not very good, right? That's not very democratic or very, free and fair and market friendly, right? But it's being done in an American state, and that means that people tend to run to their sort of party tribal lines. But it's still bad.
Yeah, Alan Elrod joining us. I think we need to change how we talk about this. You addressed this on your piece. Let's take somebody. Look, Ron DeSantis won by a huge number in his reelection. Okay, very popular. So what he's doing is very popular with his state. For somebody who agrees with somebody like Ron DeSantis on 80-90% of policy, but they think the Disney thing just went too far, that kind of folks, if you just come out and go, well, Ron DeSantis is clearly a dictator now. Well, no, that's too far too. That's hyperbole. No, he's not a dictator. He was duly elected, and his base that elected him really likes this. I think it's cynical and political theater, and I think it's a little hypocritical too when you dig into the specifics of how we're going to do it, we're not going to do it kind of stuff. But no, he's not a dictator. Both of those extremes, those buzzwords aren't helping the conversation whatsoever. So if you got somebody that likes a politician, I'm just picking on Ron DeSantis here for the example. Somebody who likes most of what he does, but he does one thing that's too far here. Let's just pick the Disney thing. How do we talk about that in a non-buzzword 2023 overhyped social media way where you have to go, well, I have to like everything he wants, or I'm a libby lib, or he's a dictator. You see what I'm saying? We got to find a better way to discuss differences like that, because if you're talking to somebody that's reasonable, you can persuade them or discuss it. But if you start with the extremes, you got no chance. How's a better way to discuss a topic like that?
Well, and I can happily throw out the example, right, of my new governor in Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who just signed a bunch of executive orders on Tuesday, right after her inauguration, right? Also sort of limiting CRT and K-12. She also did this thing where she banned the use of the word Latinx in government documents, and I that may even be a good point of comparison, because Latinx is not especially popular among many Latinos, although some use it. But the question there is really similar to this question with Ron DeSantis of, is the step of banning it appropriate, right? And I think that's where you have to have the conversation. Liberal democracy lives and thrives, and it also, is at risk and potentially perishes at the sort of general commitment to these principles. So I think it's important to say, look, everything isn't a question of, full free democracy or dictatorship. There's a lot of nuance in between where we can say, well, what I'm worried about is, a culture, a political culture, or even specifically a state administration that is willing to go after companies or after groups in this way. To me, what does that set up for future administrations who want to go after other groups, right, that you're even less comfortable with, right? And that can sound preposterous, right? But at the same time, right, criminalizing drag shows is not is not a moderate or mild policy. And I do think, with Ron DeSantis, I get worried with it because, he's not a dictator. He's the governor of a state. But at the same time, American democracy made up of 50 states. And if you see the degradation of the quality of democracy or the quality of sort of civic life in a given state, especially a state as big as Florida, that does actually have a kind of, deleterious effect on the quality of democratic life in the country. And I do also get worried when you have people like, I cite Rod Dreher in the piece, living over in Hungary, who love Viktor Orban, and who look at DeSantis and say, actually, no, I agree this guy is kind of like Orban, who has sort of taken over his country's higher education system and passed lots of anti-LGBTQ laws and been very kind of assertive about this sort of very rigid, mythical, hagiographic idea of Hungarian history. It's just that I think those comparisons are great and good. Well, that actually should disturb us a little bit. So I think there's a way we can be fair. We don't want to be hyperbolic, but at the same time, I'm not inclined to cut him excessive slack. Especially the way his spokesperson Christina Bashaw has conducted herself, going out and saying, if you oppose the Don't Say Gay bill, then not only may you be a groomer, but you're probably indifferent, right, to essentially the sexual violation of children. That is not the kind of thing that a public mouthpiece should be saying in a United States jurisdiction.
Alan Elrod joined it, but she's saying it because it works.
Oh yeah,
And
it
she's
does.
hired specifically to say it. And here's the thing. I don't like it. I don't care for her style and what she does whatsoever. We're going to see more and more of that because we have a template now. We have a template of the last few years that there's a segment of the electorate that really, really likes that stuff. So how do we, if you don't like that stuff, even if you agree with what, let's just hypothetical this a little bit. If you agree with, let me use the same number again, 80, 90% of what they're doing, and you don't like the messaging they're doing, how do we discuss that? Because like you just said, part of where the pluralistic society starts breaking down is it's not just tolerating somebody that's different than you. It's also being able to communicate and get along with the people that are different than you. And
Absolutely.
I think that's where that becomes an issue of how are you going to govern all the people when you're, balkanizing them just to get elected in the first place? I understand it's going to be successful. I understand it hits all the right buttons. I understand it works. I'm not dumb. And maybe it's a little pie in the sky, but there is better ways of doing it than that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think to me, I won't try to answer this in any way as, advice for political strategists or people who want to win campaigns. But if we're talking on a more interpersonal level, I do think there is a question of which, like, can you be brave enough? I know brave may sound like an overplayed word here, but can you kind of be brave enough to model this stuff yourself, right? Can you extend it first? Can you be someone who's willing to embrace, not just shutting down people who disagree with you? And that includes some things that might be very uncomfortable. And I think a lot of people struggle with this, where they conflate sort of, well, not fighting to shut down speech that I think is offensive means I'm saying it's okay. It doesn't, right? You can vigorously oppose and object to it, but can you kind of model that yourself? I think some of it takes that. Can we try every day to be people who kind of try to resist that instinct that happens so often, like online, to pile on people or to call for people's jobs or those things? I mean, those are little things, but they add up. Can we be people who participate in trying to foster that much more sort of open, dynamic, vigorous way of engaging in public and civic life?
Yeah, he's Alan Elrod, President and CEO of the Pulaski Institute. He teaches at ASU BB. This piece is in Arc Digital, a wonderful publication that's got a lot of different stuff in it. I've wrote there back in the day a couple of times. Make sure you check that out as well. Alan, let folks know where they can follow you and keep up with you. We're going to link to the pieces and to your organization, but let folks know what you're about and how they can follow you until they get you back on Hertel again.
Phenomenal. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at AS Elrod, so ASELROD. I'd love it if people would come visit us at the Pulaski Institution, which is just www.pulaskiinstitution.org. We have a number of things there. You can find our podcast, which is called The Periphery from the Pulaski Institution. It's available on Spotify, on Google Music, Amazon Music, Stitcher, other places like that. You can read our blogs, one of which we're really proud of is the 50 Takes on Democracy series, because part of what we're focused at Pulaski is subnational democracy. And we've been inviting academics and journalists and other experts to write about sort of the state of democracy in their state. I'm proud of the pieces we have so far. We've got some pieces coming in the next few months on Indiana, California, the District of Columbia, and we've already got pieces up on places like Tennessee, Alabama, and Kansas, and more. And obviously, you can read me at Arc Digital, where I am a columnist, and I think Arc is a place that really embodies a lot of stuff we're talking about pluralism and openness to ideas.
Speaking of pluralism and openness to ideas, is Pulaski County still a blue county? Because that blew my mind when I first moved there back in 2000.
It is. It is, and it's one of the few ones that probably still is. Little Rock, North Little Rock, Jacksonville are still all pretty democratic. The second district, which includes mostly Pulaski, is still a little bit pinkish. I mean, we're represented by Republicans at every congressional district, which is, I'm not saying there's something inherently wrong with that, but it's not an especially politically diverse state. That's true.
It's a very interesting political state, and I got there right at the tail end of the Clinton presidency, so it was real. To show my age here, the other Huckabee was governor at the time.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah, I don't know if people realize. Yeah, we're now on to our second generation of Huckabee in the governor's mansion. So
Yeah,
we'll see how it goes.
I was there for the tail end of his administration and the pardon fiasco, but we'll talk about that some other day.
Right.
Alan Elrod, really enjoyed this. This is an important topic. It's not the buzzwordy stuff. It's not the trending stuff. This is the core stuff that we got to get a handle on to make things better. Appreciate your time today. We'll have you back soon.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, sir.